What if I told you that something as small as 5 minutes could completely change the direction of your life or destroy it? A former member of an occult group once said, "We didn't lose people in big moments. We lost them in small, skipped rituals, not wars, not disasters, but 5 quiet minutes of neglect." Across different parts of the world, including fringe reports from underground groups in the USA and parts of Kenya, the idea of hidden rituals has always carried a mysterious reputation. In the United States, urban legends and testimonies from ex members of secret spiritual circles often describe strict daily practices meant to control mindset, discipline, or belief systems. Similarly, in parts of Kenya, stories have circulated about secluded groups where symbolic ritual routines are followed with intense seriousness, not always supernatural, but psychological, emotional, or belief driven conditioning. Now, whether people believe in the supernatural side or not, one truth remains consistent: these groups understood something powerful. Human behavior is shaped by repeated small actions. But here's the real question: what if the ritual isn't mystical at all? What if it's not about shadows, symbols, or secrecy? What if it's about something far more dangerous and far more real? Because according to the former member, the 5 minute ritual wasn't about magic, it was about control. And once you skip it, everything starts to slip. Consistency is one of those forces that appears simple on the surface but becomes almost unsettling when you begin to understand its depth. It does not announce itself with drama, nor does it demand attention in the way sudden talent or rare opportunity does. Instead, it works quietly, almost invisibly, shaping outcomes long before a person realizes anything is changing. The idea that just a few minutes each day can redirect the entire structure of a life feels too small to be taken seriously at first. Yet that is exactly where its power lies. 5 minutes does not feel like transformation time. It feels like something easily skipped, something negotiable, something that can be sacrificed without consequence. But the hidden reality is that consistency does not measure effort in single moments. It measures identity through repetition. When an action is repeated daily, even in its smallest form, it begins to carve pathways in behavior that slowly become automatic. The mind does not separate small and big in the way people assume. It simply records repetition. If something is done once, it is a choice. If it is done repeatedly, it becomes a pattern. And when a pattern is stable enough, it starts to feel like personality. This is where consistency becomes powerful in a way that is not immediately visible. It does not change a person overnight, it changes what a person considers normal. And once normality shifts, identity follows without resistance. That is why even 5 focused minutes can feel insignificant on day one, but undeniable on day 100. The change is not loud, but it is irreversible in subtle ways. What makes consistency even more intriguing is how it quietly competes with inconsistency. Every time a planned action is skipped, The mind does not simply ignore it. It registers a different kind of pattern forming. Skipping once feels harmless, but the mind begins to learn that skipping is also an option. Over time, two competing identities begin to form, one that builds through repetition and one that dissolves through interruption. The struggle is not dramatic, it is psychological erosion. The surprising part is that both directions feel equally small in the moment. Building and breaking both look like minor decisions when they are happening, yet one accumulates strength while the other accumulates weakness. This silent accumulation is what makes consistency such a powerful force in shaping outcomes that appear sudden later, but were actually prepared slowly over time. As this idea deepens, it becomes clear that consistency is less about motivation and more about structure. Motivation rises and falls, influenced by mood, environment, and emotion. But structure remains even when motivation disappears. 5 minutes of action performed, regardless of feeling, begins to separate disciplined behavior from emotional behavior. That separation is where transformation begins to take root, because once action is no longer dependent on emotional permission, progress becomes independent of internal resistance. This is why consistency often feels difficult at the beginning, but becomes strangely automatic later. The resistance weakens not because effort becomes easier, but because repetition reduces negotiation within the mind. And yet, the most interesting aspect is not just what consistency builds, but what it silently replaces. Every repeated action removes the space previously occupied by doubt, delay, and distraction. The mind is always filling itself with something. If consistent actions are not present, inconsistent ones fill the gap. Over time, the difference between people is not always intelligence or opportunity, but what their repetitive actions have quietly trained them to accept as normal behavior. 5 minutes may not seem like a competitive advantage, but when multiplied by days, weeks, and months, it becomes a force that quietly separates direction from stagnation without making noise about it. Closely connected to this is the idea that the mind follows routine with surprising loyalty. Human behavior is not as random as it feels, it is deeply patterned. The mind is constantly searching for efficiency, and nothing is more efficient than repetition. Once a behavior is repeated enough times, the brain begins to automate it to save energy. This is why habits form without constant awareness. The mind is not asking whether a habit is good or bad. It is asking whether it is familiar. Familiarity becomes comfort, and comfort becomes repetition. This cycle is subtle, but it is one of the most powerful forces in shaping a person's direction in life. What is fascinating is how identity begins to merge with routine. A person does not simply do something repeatedly, they begin to become the kind of person who does it. The distinction between action and identity starts to blur. For example, someone who consistently spends even a small amount of time learning begins to see themselves as someone who learns. Someone who consistently avoids effort begins to see avoidance as part of their nature. This transformation does not happen through declaration, but through accumulation. The mind updates identity based on evidence, not intention, and repeated action is the strongest form of evidence the mind accepts. Even more intriguing is how the mind resists new routines at first, not because they are difficult, but because they are unfamiliar. There is a natural psychological friction when attempting to introduce structure into chaos. The first few days of consistency often feel heavier than the action itself should feel. This is the moment where most change collapses, not due to inability, but due to resistance disguised as inconvenience. The mind prefers old patterns because they require no adjustment. But once repetition crosses a certain threshold, resistance begins to fade, and the new pattern starts to feel like it was always there. This shift is so subtle that it often goes unnoticed, yet it is the exact moment when a behavior stops being a choice and starts becoming a default. As these patterns continue to strengthen, something even deeper begins to happen beneath awareness. The mind starts predicting behavior based on past repetition. It begins to expect consistency from itself or expect inconsistency depending on what has been practiced more. This predictive nature is what makes routine so powerful. It does not just reflect who a person is, it begins to shape who a person will likely become in the next moment. The present becomes less about decision making and more about following an established trajectory created by repeated small actions that were once considered insignificant. Neglect rarely announces itself in a way that feels dangerous. It does not begin with collapse or obvious failure. It begins with something far more ordinary, almost harmless. A delay here, a postponement there, a decision to start tomorrow instead of today. At first, these moments feel insignificant, like soft interruptions in an otherwise stable routine. Nothing dramatic happens, nothing breaks, nothing changes in a visible way. That is exactly what makes neglect so deceptive. It does not need force to grow, it only needs permission in small doses. And the most dangerous permission is the one that feels justified in the moment. What makes neglect so powerful is its ability to disguise itself as reason. It do. It's not say stop completely. It says not today. It does not destroy discipline in one strike. It gently negotiates it away piece by piece. Each skipped moment feels rational, even intelligent, because the mind is extremely skilled at defending short term comfort. The problem is not the first skip, the problem is what the mind learns from it. Once a task is skipped without immediate consequence, the brain quietly records a new possibility that action is optional. And once something becomes optional in the mind, its emotional weight begins to shrink. This is when neglect begins to shift from an action into a pattern. One skipped moment creates the foundation for another, not because the task becomes harder, but because resistance becomes weaker. The mind does not fight repetition, it adapts to it. If avoidance is repeated, avoidance becomes familiar, and familiarity slowly replaces urgency. What once felt important begins to feel flexible, and what was once non negotiable becomes negotiable. This is the subtle transformation that makes neglect so difficult to notice while it is happening. The most unsettling part is how quickly the mind normalizes absence. A routine that is broken once does not feel destroyed, it feels temporarily paused. But after a few repetitions of pausing, the original structure begins to blur. The mind stops remembering the routine as something consistent and starts remembering it as something occasional. This shift is silent but significant because identity is built on what is remembered as normal behavior. When consistency fades from memory, discipline no longer feels like identity. It feels like effort again. And effort always invites resistance. Neglect also has a way of expanding into other areas of life without permission. When discipline is weakened in one small domain, the mind begins to generalize that weakness. If one commitment can be ignored, others start to feel less binding as well. This is not a conscious decision, it is psychological spillover. The mind prefers patterns, and once it learns that interruption is acceptable in one area, it becomes easier to apply the same logic elsewhere. Slowly, what began as a single skipped action can influence an entire system of behavior without the person noticing the spread. Even more intriguing is how neglect changes perception of time. When actions are consistent, time feels structured, almost predictable. But when neglect enters, time begins to feel fragmented. Days lose clarity and progress becomes harder to measure. This creates a strange illusion where nothing feels fully lost, yet nothing feels fully gained either. It becomes difficult to locate improvement because there is no stable reference point. The absence of routine removes the markers that normally help track growth, leaving behind a sense of motion without direction. At the same time, the mind becomes increasingly skilled at justification. It creates explanations that protect comfort while avoiding discomfort. Phrases like, I will restart soon, or I just need a break, begin to replace action. These thoughts do not feel harmful because they are emotionally soothing, but they are structurally weakening. They maintain the illusion of control while slowly eroding actual control. The danger lies not in thinking these thoughts once, but in believing them repeatedly without verifying them through action. As neglect deepens, it begins to reshape emotional response. Tasks that were once neutral or even meaningful start to feel heavier than they actually are. This is not because the task has changed, but because the gap between intention and action has widened. The longer something is avoided, the more mental weight it accumulates. What was once a 5-minute task begins to feel like a burden simply because it has been mentally postponed too many times. The mind inflates difficulty in proportion to avoidance, not reality. And yet, neglect does not feel like destruction while it is happening. It feels like relief. Each moment of avoidance provides temporary comfort, a small release from responsibility. But that relief is deceptive because it is purchased with future resistance. The more relief is chosen in the present, the more resistance builds in the background. This hidden exchange is what makes neglect so effective and so dangerous at the same time. It trades long term strength for short term ease without drawing attention to the cost. Over time, the most significant change caused by neglect is not external but internal. It alters how a person responds to their own intentions. Promises to oneself begin to lose weight. Commitments become softer, less binding, more flexible. The mind starts to assume that intention does not necessarily require action. This separation between intention and execution is where discipline quietly dissolves. Because when intention no longer leads reliably to action, trust in one's own decisions begins to weaken alongside this. Discipline operates in a very different way. It does not rely on emotional intensity or perfect conditions. Instead, it survives through structure that continues even when motivation disappears. Discipline is not loud, it is repetitive. It does not demand inspiration. It demands return. Even when the mind resists, discipline is the decision to act anyway, not because it feels right in the moment, but because it maintains alignment with long term direction. This makes discipline less about strength in dramatic moments and more about stability in ordinary ones. What makes discipline powerful is not its intensity, but its continuity. It does not try to win every moment with force. It simply refuses to disappear. Even when broken temporarily, it has the capacity to be rebuilt without emotional negotiation. It does not interpret a missed action as identity failure. It treats it as interruption. And this distinction is crucial because it prevents one mistake from becoming a permanent narrative. As discipline continues, it begins to rebuild structure in places where neglect had created fragmentation. The mind starts to re-establish reference points, reconnecting actions with meaning and direction. Tasks regain clarity, not because they have changed, but because consistency restores their context. The same 5-minute action that once felt optional begins to feel anchored again, not due to pressure, but due to familiarity rebuilt through repetition. And in this rebuilding process, and in this rebuilding process, the mind slowly shifts back towards stability without dramatic realization that the transformation is occurring when small actions are repeated with intention. Something subtle but powerful begins to emerge beneath the surface of daily life. 5 focused minutes may appear insignificant, yet over time they begin to accumulate into outcomes that feel disproportionately large compared to their size. This is because human progress is rarely the result of sudden leaps, it is the result of compounded motion. Every small action carries a hidden multiplier effect, and that multiplier becomes visible only when time has passed. What seems like a minor effort today becomes a defining factor tomorrow, not because the action itself is extraordinary, but because repetition gives it weight that exceeds its original scale. The mind often underestimates this process because it evaluates effort in isolation rather than in accumulation. But life itself does not measure in isolated moments. It measures in sequences that build upon each other silently, almost invisibly, until the result becomes undeniable. The most fascinating aspect of small actions is how they reshape direction without announcing themselves. A person does not feel the transformation while it is happening. Instead, they notice it only when comparison becomes unavoidable. Looking back, it becomes clear that what once felt like a trivial 5-minute commitment has quietly influenced decisions, behavior, and mindset far beyond its original purpose. This is where the true power lies, not in the intensity of the action, but in its ability to repeat without interruption. Consistency turns small effort into structure, and structure eventually becomes identity. Once identity is involved, change is no longer something external being applied, it becomes something internal being expressed. At that stage, even the idea of skipping the action feels different because the mind has already associated it with a version of self that it is reluctant to abandon. Yet, even more profound is the realization that transformation often happens without emotional awareness. A person may not feel motivated, inspired, or even particularly disciplined in the moment, but the continuation of small actions still moves them forward. This disconnect between feeling and progress is what makes consistency so deceptive. It does not require emotional agreement, it simply requires physical continuation. And over time, continuation begins to override hesitation. What starts as effort gradually becomes rhythm, and what becomes rhythm eventually becomes default behavior. This is why 5 minutes, when protected daily, can outperform long but inconsistent bursts of effort because repetition builds reliability, and reliability builds momentum that does not depend on emotional fluctuations. Closely connected to this idea is the transformation of perception itself. As small actions accumulate, the mind begins to reinterpret what is possible. Tasks that once seemed difficult begin to feel manageable, not because they have changed, but because the mind has been trained through repetition to recognize familiarity within them. Familiarity reduces resistance, and reduced resistance increases willingness. This shift is not dramatic, but it is foundational. It changes how challenges are approached, how decisions are made, and how effort is perceived. Over time, what once, what require, persuasion begins to require only initiation, and initiation becomes easier because the mind no longer treats it as unfamiliar territory. Even more interesting is how consistency influences without directly targeting it. Confidence is often assumed to come from success, but in reality, it is deeply tied to evidence. When a person repeatedly completes even small commitments, the mind begins to build a record of reliability. That record becomes internal proof that action will follow intention. With enough repetition, doubt loses its authority, not because it is eliminated, but because it is outnumbered by evidence of follow through. This is how confidence grows quietly, through accumulation of kept promises to oneself rather than dramatic achievements. Over time, This accumulation begins to affect decision making in unexpected ways. A person who consistently follows through on small actions becomes more likely to trust their own direction, not because they're always correct, but because they have built a pattern of execution. The mind begins to assume continuity between thought and action, and that assumption reduces internal conflict. Decisions become smoother, less fragmented, because there is less negotiation between intention and avoidance. This internal alignment is one of the most powerful outcomes of consistent small actions, even though it is rarely recognized as such in the beginning. Eventually, the impact extends beyond behavior into mindset. The idea of starting something new becomes less intimidating because the mind has already been conditioned to act regularly. Starting no longer feels like a major emotional hurdle. It feels like a continuation of existing rhythm. This is where momentum becomes self sustaining. Once action is normalized, inactivity begins to feel like the unusual state rather than the default one. That reversal is subtle but transformative because it shifts the baseline of identity from hesitation to movement without requiring dramatic effort. At this stage, the importance of small actions becomes clear in hindsight, even if it was invisible in the beginning. What appeared to be insignificant time investment reveals itself as structural development of discipline, identity, and mental resilience. The repetition that once felt ordinary becomes the foundation of capability, and the accumulation that once felt slow becomes the source of visible progress. The mind begins to recognize that it was never the size of the effort that mattered most, but the refusal to break continuity, because continuity is what turns intention into transformation and repetition into inevitable direction. In conclusion, the most powerful lesson hidden within all of this is surprisingly simple yet deeply overlooked. It is never the size of the action that shapes a life, but the consistency behind it. 5 minutes may feel small, even forgettable in the moment, but when protected and repeated, it becomes a force that quietly builds discipline, reshapes identity, and strengthens direction. On the other hand, neglect does not destroy life in one sudden moment. It weakens it slowly through repeated delays and quiet interruptions that feel harmless at first. What begins as just today can easily become a pattern, and that pattern gradually turns into AM, if styled without permission. This is why awareness matters so much, because the real battle is not fought in dramatic moments, but in ordinary decisions that seem too small to matter. Over time, consistency builds a version of a person that is stronger, more stable, and more aligned with long term goals, while inconsistency slowly erodes that structure without making noise. The difference between the two is not talent or luck, but the ability to continue when motivation fades. And that is where true transformation happens. Not intensity, but in repetition. Not in motivation, but in discipline. And not in big decisions, but in the quiet commitment to keep going, even when it feels insignificant. When this understanding becomes clear, life stops being about occasional effort and starts becoming about daily direction, where every small action contributes to something far greater than it appears in the moment. Thank you for watching this video. If you found value in this message, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful and thought-provoking content like this. Your support means a lot and helps this channel grow. See you in the next video.